The municipal courthouse on 3rd Street was packed that Tuesday morning. People filled every wooden bench in the gallery, waiting for their cases to be called. Some looked nervous, shuffling through papers. Others seemed bored, checking their phones every few seconds. The air conditioning hummed loudly, fighting against the summer heat that pressed through the tall windows. At exactly 9:30, a 17-year-old boy walked through the heavy courtroom doors. He wore a faded gray hoodie with a small tear near the pocket, jeans that had seen better days, and sneakers that were held together more by hope than by their remaining stitches. His dark hair stuck up in odd directions like he'd just rolled out of bed. Under his arm, he carried a thin folder that looked like it had been used 100 times before. The boy made his way to the front of the courtroom, his footsteps echoing slightly on the marble floor. A few people glanced up from their phones, then quickly looked away. The bailiff, a heavy-set man with gray hair and a permanent frown, watched the boy approach with barely concealed annoyance. "Name?" the bailiff asked, not even trying to hide the boredom in his voice. "Daniel Rodriguez," the boy replied quietly. The bailiff checked his list, running his finger down the page. "Traffic violation. You're up next. Sit over there and wait for the judge." Daniel nodded and took a seat in the front row right behind the defendant's table. He placed his folder on his lap and waited, his hands folded neatly. He looked around the courtroom, taking in the state seal on the wall, the American flag standing in the corner, the elevated judge's bench that seemed designed to make everyone else feel small. A few minutes later, the side door opened and Judge Patricia Hendricks entered. Everyone stood automatically, the way people do in courtrooms without even thinking about it. The judge was a woman in her late 50s with sharp eyes behind reading glasses that hung on a chain around her neck. She'd been on the bench for almost 20 years, and she carried herself with the confidence of someone who'd seen it all. "Be seated," she said, settling into her chair. She glanced at the docket in front of her. "Case number 47823, the state versus Daniel Rodriguez. Traffic violation." Daniel stood up and walked to the defendant's table. The prosecutor, a man named Robert Davidson, was already standing at his table, looking like this was just another routine Tuesday morning for him. He wore an expensive suit and a tie that probably cost more than Daniel's entire outfit. He barely glanced at the teenager as he sorted through his own files. "Mr. Rodriguez," Judge Hendricks said, peering at Daniel over her glasses. "I see you're representing yourself today. Do you understand you have the right to an attorney?" "Yes, Your Honor, I understand," Daniel said clearly. "And you've chosen to waive that right?" "Yes, Your Honor." The judge sighed, the kind of sigh that said she'd been through this 1,000 times. "Very well. Mr. Davidson, please present the state's case." The prosecutor stood up straighter, clearly ready to make quick work of this. "Your Honor, on the night of June 15th, Officer Thompson observed the defendant's vehicle stopped at a red light on Madison Avenue. The vehicle remained stationary for approximately 3 minutes after the light turned green, causing traffic to back up behind it. When Officer Thompson approached the vehicle, he found the defendant asleep at the wheel with the engine running. The defendant was cited for reckless driving and creating a traffic hazard. Judge Hendricks looked at Daniel. "How do you plead?" "Not guilty, Your Honor." A few snickers came from the gallery. Someone whispered something that sounded like, "waste of time." The prosecutor smiled slightly like he just heard a good joke. "Not guilty?" Judge Hendricks repeated, raising an eyebrow. "Mr. Rodriguez, the officer's report is very clear. You were sleeping in your car at a green light. That's fairly straightforward." "I understand, Your Honor, but I'd like to challenge the citation on legal grounds." More chuckles from the back of the courtroom. The bailiff rolled his eyes. Even Judge Hendricks looked amused, though she tried to hide it. "Legal grounds," she repeated slowly. "Mr. Rodriguez, have you been watching a lot of legal dramas on television?" The gallery laughed openly now. A woman in the 3rd row actually snorted. The prosecutor didn't even bother hiding his grin anymore. Daniel's face flushed red, but he kept his voice steady. "No, Your Honor. I've prepared a defense based on the actual statute and case law." "Case law," the prosecutor said, not quite under his breath. He glanced at the judge with an expression that clearly said, "Can you believe this kid?" Judge Hendricks held up a hand for quiet, but she was smiling too. "Mr. Rodriguez, I appreciate your enthusiasm, but reckless driving is a serious charge with a clear definition. You were operating a vehicle in a manner that endangered others. That's pretty much textbook." "Your Honor, my car never moved," Daniel said. It remained in the same position the entire time. Under State Statute 31 and 27101, reckless driving requires evidence of actual vehicle operation in a dangerous manner. Being stationary at a red light even for an extended period doesn't meet that threshold. The courtroom went a little quieter. A few people leaned forward. The prosecutor's smile faded slightly, but he still looked confident. "Your Honor," Davidson interjected, "the defendant's creative interpretation of the statute doesn't change the facts. He was unconscious while in control of a running vehicle on a public roadway. That's absolutely reckless behavior. I'd like to see the evidence that my vehicle posed an actual danger, Your Honor," Daniel said. He opened his worn folder and pulled out a single sheet of paper covered in neat handwriting. "According to the officer's own report, my car was stopped completely. The brake was engaged. I wasn't blocking traffic in any meaningful way, because cars could easily go around me in the adjacent lane. No accident occurred. No property was damaged. No person was injured or even put at risk." Judge Hendricks wasn't smiling anymore. She looked at Daniel with a bit more interest. "Mr. Rodriguez, where exactly did you learn about State Statute 31-27-101? "I studied it, Your Honor. I've been reading about traffic law." "You've been reading about traffic law?" she repeated flatly. "Yes, Your Honor." The prosecutor shook his head, his amusement returning. "Your Honor, with all due respect to Mr. Rodriguez's dedication to late-night internet research, the statute is clear, and my office has successfully prosecuted dozens of similar cases. The defendant was in control of a vehicle while impaired by fatigue. That's reckless. Impaired by fatigue isn't the same as being impaired by drugs or alcohol, Your Honor," Daniel said quickly. "And the statute specifically addresses impairment as a separate category from reckless operation. If I were being charged with impaired driving, that would be different. But I'm being charged with reckless driving, which requires proof that my actions created a substantial risk to others." "Your Honor," the prosecutor said, his voice taking on a harder edge, "are we really going to entertain a teenager's attempt to lawyer his way out of a ticket? This is wasting the court's time." Several people in the gallery murmured in agreement. Someone said, "Just pay the fine, kid." Daniel's jaw tightened, but he remained calm. "Your Honor, I'd also like to request the radar calibration records and Officer Thompson's training certification." The courtroom burst into laughter. Real, actual laughter. The bailiff shook his head in disbelief. The prosecutor looked at Daniel like he'd just asked for the moon. "Radar calibration?" Davidson said. "Your Honor, the defendant wasn't cited for speeding. What possible relevance could radar calibration have? The citation lists my speed as 0 miles per hour, which the officer determined using his radar device," Daniel explained. "If that device wasn't properly calibrated, then the speed measurement is unreliable, which undermines the accuracy of the entire report." Judge Hendricks leaned back in her chair, studying this scruffy teenager who was talking about calibration records and case law. "Mr. Rodriguez, that's quite a reach. I'm simply requesting that the state provide proper documentation for the evidence it's using against me." "Your Honor, that's my right." The prosecutor laughed out loud this time. "Your Honor, this is ridiculous. The kid watched a few YouTube videos and now he thinks he's Clarence Darrow. Can we please just move this along?" "I agree," Judge Hendricks said, though she didn't look as certain as she had 5 minutes ago. "Mr. Rodriguez, I'm going to give you one more chance to simply plead guilty, pay your fine, and save us all a lot of time. The fine is $500, which you can pay in installments if needed." $500. Daniel felt his stomach drop. That was 2 weeks of work at the restaurant. That was his mom's medication copay for the month. That was the difference between eating and not eating for the next few weeks. "I can't pay that." "Your Honor," he said quietly. "Then you should have thought about that before you fell asleep at a green light." Someone called from the gallery. More laughter. The judge didn't even bother calling for order this time. "Your Honor," Daniel said, his voice stronger now, "I'm not asking for special treatment. I'm asking the court to follow its own rules. If the state can't provide the basic evidence to support its charge, then the charge should be dismissed." The prosecutor slammed his folder on the table. "Your Honor, enough. This is completely out of line. The defendant is clearly just trying to delay the inevitable." Judge Hendricks looked at Daniel for a long moment. The courtroom had gone quiet again, waiting to see what would happen. Here was this kid, barely old enough to vote, standing in clothes that looked like they came from a thrift store. challenging a prosecutor who'd been practicing law longer than the kid had been alive. "Mr. Rodriguez," the judge said finally, "do you really think you can argue your way out of this?" Daniel met her eyes. "I think the law matters, Your Honor, even for people like me." Something in the way he said it made the judge pause. The laughter stopped. For just a moment, the courtroom felt different. Judge Hendricks adjusted her glasses and looked down at the paperwork in front of her. The courtroom had gone from a place of barely restrained laughter to something more serious. People were actually paying attention now, leaning forward in their seats to hear what would happen next. "Mr. Davidson," the judge said, turning to the prosecutor, "do you have the calibration records that Mr. Rodriguez is requesting?" The prosecutor looked caught off guard. He shuffled through his folder, flipping pages quickly. "Your Honor, I didn't think to bring them because they're not relevant to this case. The defendant wasn't cited for speeding. But the officer did use a radar device to determine the vehicle's speed, correct?" Daniel asked. "The speed was 0, Davidson shot back. "You were stopped. Anyone with eyes could see that. We don't need a radar device to prove you weren't moving." "Then why did Officer Thompson include the radar reading in his report?" Daniel asked. He held up his copy of the citation. "Right here it says speed 0 mpg, verified by radar. If the state is using that device's measurement as evidence, even evidence that I wasn't moving, then the device needs to be properly calibrated according to state regulations." Judge Hendricks was quiet for a moment. "He has a point, Mr. Davidson." The prosecutor's confident expression started to crack. "Your Honor, this is a technicality. A ridiculous technicality designed to waste the court's time." "It's not a technicality," Daniel said, his voice growing stronger. "It's proper procedure. Under State Regulation 42.3, all traffic enforcement devices must be calibrated every 6 months, and those records must be available upon request. If the state is going to use that radar reading as evidence, even to show I was stopped, then they need to prove the device was working correctly." "Where are you getting this?" the prosecutor demanded. "Who's been helping you?" Daniel's face flushed again. "Nobody's been helping me. I read the regulations myself." "You just happened to read obscure traffic regulations?" Davidson's voice dripped with skepticism. "They're not obscure if you're the one being charged," Daniel replied. A few people in the gallery made sounds of agreement. The mood was shifting. What had started as entertainment was becoming something else. People were starting to see this wasn't just some kid trying to be difficult. He actually knew what he was talking about. Judge Hendricks tapped her pen on the bench. "Mr. Davidson, can you provide the calibration records or not?" The prosecutor hesitated. "Not immediately, Your Honor. I'd need to request them from the police department." "How long would that take?" "A few days, perhaps a week." "So you're asking for a continuance?" the judge asked. "If necessary, Your Honor." Daniel stepped forward. "Your Honor, the state had months to prepare for this hearing. The citation was issued in June. It's now September. They've had plenty of time to gather their evidence. Granting a continuance now would be prejudicial to me." "Prejudicial?" The prosecutor actually laughed. "Your Honor, the defendant is throwing around legal terms he doesn't understand." "Actually," Daniel said calmly, "prejudicial means that delaying this case would cause me harm." And it would. Every day this hangs over me, I have to worry about it. I took time off work to be here today, which means I lost wages. If we continue this case, I'll have to take more time off, lose more money. All because the state didn't bring the evidence it's legally required to have. Judge Hendricks studied Daniel with growing interest. "You took time off work? What kind of work do you do?" "I work at Pete's Diner on 5th Avenue. I'm a line cook." "And you're how old?" 17, Your Honor. "Shouldn't you be in school?" "It's summer break, Your Honor. School starts next week." The judge nodded slowly. "Mr. Rodriguez, I have to say you're demonstrating a remarkable understanding of courtroom procedure for someone your age." "Have you taken legal classes?" "No, Your Honor." "Then where did you learn all this?" Daniel hesitated. He didn't want to sound like he was bragging, but he also didn't want to lie. "I've been studying on my own, Your Honor. I use the library's computers to read cases and regulations. I want to understand how the system works." Why? The judge asked. It wasn't an accusatory question. She seemed genuinely curious. "Because I've seen people get pushed around by the system when they don't understand it," Daniel said. "I don't want to be one of those people." The courtroom was completely silent now. Even the bailiff had stopped looking bored. The prosecutor, sensing that things were not going his way, tried to regain control. Your Honor, with all due respect to Mr. Rodriguez's self-education, he's still making arguments that don't hold water. The calibration of a radar device used to verify a vehicle was stopped is not material to a reckless driving charge. Then why use the radar at all? Daniel asked. Why include it in the report if it's not material? The truth is, Your Honor, that Officer Thompson's entire citation is based on sloppy procedure. He didn't follow proper protocol because he assumed this was a simple case that nobody would challenge. But just because I'm young and can't afford a lawyer doesn't mean I don't have rights. Nobody said you don't have rights, Davidson said, irritation clear in his voice now. With respect, sir, you've been suggesting that since I walked in here, Daniel replied. You've called my defense a waste of time. You've implied I don't understand the law. You've laughed at my request for basic evidence, all because I don't look like someone who belongs in a courtroom. The prosecutor's face went red. That's not what I was suggesting at all. Then provide the calibration records, Daniel said simply. If everything was done properly, the records will show that. If they can't be provided, then the citation should be dismissed. Judge Hendricks held up her hand. All right, that's enough. Mr. Davidson, I'm going to ask you a simple question. Do you have any evidence beyond Officer Thompson's report that proves Mr. Rodriguez was driving recklessly? The prosecutor opened his mouth, then closed it. He looked down at his file. The officer's testimony would be sufficient, Your Honor. Is Officer Thompson here today? No, Your Honor. We didn't think his presence would be necessary for such a straightforward case. So you have a report from an officer who isn't here to testify, based partly on a radar device you can't prove was properly calibrated, citing my defendant for reckless driving when his vehicle never actually moved and caused no damage or injury to anyone. The judge summarized. When she put it that way, it sounded pretty weak. The prosecutor knew it too. Your Honor, the defendant was unconscious in his vehicle. That's inherently dangerous. Was there any evidence he was impaired by alcohol or drugs? Daniel asked. Davidson checked the report. No. Any evidence of prior incidents? Not that's relevant to this case. Any evidence that I was actually endangering anyone? The prosecutor didn't answer right away. He flipped through the pages again like he was hoping to find something he'd missed. Finally, he looked up at the judge. Your Honor, the statute doesn't require proof of actual harm. It requires proof of reckless behavior. And falling asleep at a red light after working a double shift is reckless, Daniel asked. Not illegal parking? Not obstruction? Reckless driving? The same charge they give to people racing through neighborhoods at twice the speed limit? A double shift? Judge Hendricks asked, looking at Daniel. Is that why you fell asleep? Daniel nodded. Yes, Your Honor. I worked from 6 in the morning until midnight. I was driving home when I stopped at that light. I didn't mean to fall asleep. I was just exhausted. Why were you working such long hours? Daniel looked uncomfortable. I needed the money, Your Honor. For what? You're 17. Don't your parents support you? There was a long pause. Daniel looked down at his worn sneakers, then back up at the judge. It's just me and my mom, Your Honor, and she's sick. I work to help pay for her treatments. The courtroom went completely still. Even the prosecutor looked uncomfortable now. Judge Hendricks's expression softened slightly, but she maintained her professional composure. I'm sorry to hear that, she said quietly. But Mr. Rodriguez, that doesn't change the fact that you fell asleep in your car on a public road. I understand that, Your Honor, and I'm not making excuses. I'm just saying that what happened doesn't meet the legal definition of reckless driving. If the state wants to charge me with something else, something more appropriate, I'll accept that. But a $500 fine for reckless driving? That's not justice. That's just punishing someone for being poor and tired. The prosecutor started to object, but Judge Hendricks cut him off with a look. She was thinking, weighing everything she'd heard. The courtroom waited. Mr. Rodriguez, the judge finally said, you've made several compelling arguments today. I'm frankly surprised by your knowledge of legal procedure. However, I'm still not convinced that the calibration records are relevant to this case. Daniel took a breath. Your Honor, they're relevant because they go to the question of whether proper procedure was followed. If Officer Thompson didn't follow procedure in documenting my vehicle's speed, what else didn't he follow procedure on? Did he properly identify himself? Did he have probable cause to approach my vehicle? Did he follow protocol in issuing the citation? These aren't frivolous questions. They're fundamental to whether this citation is valid. He's grasping at straws, the prosecutor muttered. Am I? Daniel asked. Your Honor, I'd like to cite the case of State v. Morrison decided by the appellate court 3 years ago. In that case, the court ruled that when an officer fails to follow proper documentation procedures, it raises questions about the entire traffic stop. The court said, and I'm paraphrasing here, that procedure exists for a reason, and officers can't pick and choose which rules to follow. Judge Hendricks sat up straighter. You've read State v. Morrison? Yes, Your Honor. It's one of the leading cases on traffic stop procedures in this state. The prosecutor was staring at Daniel now with an expression that was no longer amused or annoyed. It was something closer to concerned. Your Honor, I'm not familiar with that case. I'd need time to review it. It's from 2022, Daniel said. The citation is 447 State Reports, page 893. Judge Hendricks was writing this down. The prosecutor was frantically making notes, too. Nobody was laughing anymore. Nobody was rolling their eyes. The scruffy teenager in the torn sneakers had just quoted a legal precedent from memory, complete with the citation number. Mr. Rodriguez, the judge said slowly. How many cases have you read? Daniel shrugged slightly. I don't know, Your Honor, a lot. Whenever I have free time, I read cases on the library computer. Why? She asked again. Daniel met her eyes. Because I want to be a lawyer someday, Your Honor. And I figure the best way to learn is to read what real lawyers and judges actually say. The courtroom felt different now. The air itself seemed to have changed. What had started as a routine traffic case, something that should have been over in 5 minutes, had turned into something nobody expected. People in the gallery were whispering to each other, pointing at Daniel, trying to figure out who this kid really was. Judge Hendricks removed her glasses and cleaned them slowly with a cloth from her desk. It was a delaying tactic, giving herself time to think. When she put them back on, she looked at Daniel with an expression that was hard to read. Mr. Rodriguez, let me make sure I understand this correctly. You're 17 years old, you work as a cook at a diner. You're taking care of your sick mother. And in your spare time, you're teaching yourself law by reading court cases at the public library. Yes, Your Honor. And you've read enough cases to cite State v. Morrison from memory, including the page number. Yes, Your Honor. The prosecutor, Davidson, had stopped looking smug entirely. He was leafing through his notes, trying to find something, anything, to regain control of the situation. Finally, he looked up. Your Honor, I think we're getting distracted from the central issue here. Regardless of Mr. Rodriguez's impressive self-study habits, the facts of the case remain unchanged. He was found asleep in his vehicle on a public road. That's the bottom line. The bottom line, Daniel said, is that the state hasn't proven I committed the crime I'm charged with. Reckless driving requires proof that my actions created a substantial and unjustifiable risk to others. Being tired isn't reckless. Being stopped safely at a red light isn't reckless. If I'd been driving dangerously, weaving through traffic, running lights, then yes, that would be reckless. But I stopped at a red light and fell asleep. That's not the same thing. You could have been rear-ended, the prosecutor argued. Other drivers could have been confused or had to swerve around you. According to Officer Thompson's report, traffic simply went around me in the next lane, Daniel countered. No near misses were reported. No accidents occurred. No complaints from other drivers. The only reason this became an issue at all is because the officer happened to drive by 20 minutes after I'd stopped. 20 minutes? Judge Hendricks asked. Daniel nodded. Yes, Your Honor. According to the timestamps in the report, the officer noted that the light had cycled multiple times. Based on the timing of that intersection, which I checked, that means I was sitting there for at least 20 minutes before he approached my vehicle. The prosecutor jumped on this. 20 minutes. You were unconscious in your car for 20 minutes and you don't think that's a problem? I think it's a sign that I was exhausted from working 16 hours straight, Daniel said. But more importantly, Your Honor, it shows that I wasn't blocking traffic in any meaningful way. If I had been, someone would have called the police much sooner. Other drivers simply went around me. Nobody was endangered. Judge Hendricks was reading the police report now, really reading it, not just skimming like she had before. Her finger traced down the page, stopping at certain sections. Mr. Davidson, she said, not looking up. The report does indicate that traffic was flowing normally around the defendant's vehicle. It also notes that the defendant was in the right lane, not the left or middle lane, which would make it easier for traffic to pass. That doesn't change the fact that he was a hazard, the prosecutor insisted. But his voice had less conviction now. A potential hazard, Daniel corrected. But the law doesn't punish people for potential hazards that never materialize. If it did, everyone who ever changed lanes or made a turn would be guilty of reckless driving because those actions have the potential to cause accidents. A woman in the back of the courtroom started clapping. Just a few soft claps, but enough that everyone turned to look. The bailiff shot her a warning glare and she stopped, but she was smiling. Judge Hendricks held up a hand for silence. Mr. Rodriguez, I want to ask you something. You clearly know your way around a courtroom. You've prepared well. Why didn't you try to get a public defender? You might qualify based on your financial situation. Daniel's expression tightened. I tried, Your Honor. I called the public defender's office 3 times. They said they were backlogged and that traffic cases weren't a priority. They said I should just pay the fine or plead it down to a lesser charge. And why didn't you take that advice? Because I didn't do what they're accusing me of, Daniel said simply. And because that $500 fine isn't just money to me, it's my mom's medication. It's our rent. It's food. I can't just pay it and move on. This matters to me. The prosecutor started to say something, but Judge Hendricks silenced him with a look. She was focused entirely on Daniel now. Your mother is sick. What's wrong with her, if you don't mind me asking? Daniel hesitated. This felt too personal, too raw to share in a courtroom full of strangers. But the judge had asked directly, and he had to answer. She has cancer, Your Honor, stage 4. She's been fighting it for 2 years now. The courtroom went completely silent. Not the silence of people waiting to see what happens next, but the heavy silence that comes when people don't know what to say. Several people in the gallery looked down at their hands. The bailiff's stern expression softened just a bit. I'm very sorry, Judge Hendricks said, and she sounded like she meant it. That must be incredibly difficult. Thank you, Your Honor, Daniel said quietly. The prosecutor cleared his throat. He looked uncomfortable, like he wasn't sure whether to continue pressing his case or let it go. He chose to continue, but his tone had changed. Your Honor, I sympathize with Mr. Rodriguez's situation. I truly do. But we can't dismiss charges because someone is going through a hard time. If we did that, the entire justice system would fall apart. Everyone has a sob story. Daniel's head snapped up. His eyes were suddenly bright with anger, though he kept his voice level. This isn't a sob story, sir. It's my life. And I'm not asking for sympathy. I'm asking for the law to be applied correctly. Those are 2 different things. Mr. Davidson, Judge Hendricks said, her voice cold. I'd suggest you choose your words more carefully. This young man has been nothing but respectful to this court, which is more than I can say for how this court has treated him. The prosecutor looked like he'd been slapped. Your Honor, I didn't mean to suggest. You suggested exactly what it sounded like you suggested, the judge interrupted. Now let's get back to the legal issues at hand. Mr. Rodriguez has raised legitimate questions about the sufficiency of the evidence and the proper application of the reckless driving statute. I want to hear your response to those questions, not your opinions about his personal life. Davidson took a breath, visibly trying to compose himself. Your Honor, the statute is clear. Reckless driving is defined as operating a vehicle in willful or wanton disregard for the safety of persons or property. The defendant was operating his vehicle while impaired by fatigue. The vehicle wasn't moving, Daniel said. How can you operate a vehicle that's not moving? The engine was running. You were in the driver's seat. That's operating a vehicle under the law. Then every person sitting in a parked car with the engine running would be operating a vehicle, Daniel pointed out. Is that really what the statute means? Judge Hendricks leaned forward. Mr. Davidson, that's actually a good point. Is simply sitting in a parked car with the engine on sufficient to constitute operating a vehicle? The prosecutor flipped through his papers again. There's case law that supports that interpretation, Your Honor. Can you cite it? Davidson fumbled with his notes. I don't have the specific citation in front of me. But I do, Daniel said. He opened his worn folder and pulled out a sheet of paper covered in neat handwriting. The case the state usually cites for this is State v. Chen from 2018. But that case involved a defendant who was drunk in a parking lot with the engine running. The court found that he was operating the vehicle because he had the ability and intent to drive it. But the key word there is intent. The court specifically said that simply having the engine on isn't enough. There has to be evidence that the person intended to drive. And you didn't intend to drive? The prosecutor asked skeptically. Not while I was asleep, no, Daniel said. I'd stopped at a red light. I was waiting for it to turn green. I didn't intend to fall asleep. When Officer Thompson woke me up, I was confused and disoriented. The first thing I did was apologize and move my car to the side of the road. I wasn't trying to drive anywhere. I was trying to get home safely, and I'd stopped precisely because I knew I was too tired to continue. If you knew you were too tired, you shouldn't have been driving at all, Davidson argued. You're right, Daniel admitted. In hindsight, I should have pulled over somewhere safe and taken a nap. But I was 3 blocks from home. I thought I could make it. I was wrong. But being wrong isn't the same as being reckless. Judge Hendricks was writing notes now, her pen moving quickly across the paper. The courtroom waited, everyone watching her, trying to read her expression. Finally, she looked up. Mr. Rodriguez, you've cited State v. Morrison and State v. Chen from memory. What other cases have you studied that are relevant here? Daniel didn't even pause. State v. Thompson from 2020, which dealt with the definition of reckless versus negligent driving. State v. Williams from 2019, which established that reckless driving requires proof of conscious disregard for safety, and State v. Parker from 2021, which held that fatigue alone doesn't constitute recklessness unless the driver knew they were dangerously impaired and chose to drive anyway. The prosecutor's jaw had literally dropped. Judge Hendricks was staring at Daniel with an expression that was part amazement, part disbelief. You have all of those memorized? She asked. Not word for word, Your Honor, but I know the key holdings and how they apply. How many hours have you spent studying this? Daniel shrugged. I don't know exactly. Hundreds, probably. Maybe more. Whenever I'm not working or taking care of my mom, I'm at the library. A man in the gallery stood up suddenly. He was wearing a suit and he had a notebook in his hand. Your Honor, may I approach? Judge Hendricks looked annoyed at the interruption. Who are you? My name is Richard Wells. I'm a reporter with the Herald Tribune. I've been covering this case. This is a routine traffic case, the judge said. Why would you be covering it? Because it stopped being routine about 10 minutes ago, the reporter said. Your Honor, I've been following Mr. Rodriguez's story for a few weeks now. I know who he is. Daniel's face went pale. The prosecutor looked confused. Judge Hendricks's expression was unreadable. Explain, the judge ordered. The reporter glanced at Daniel, who was staring at him with something close to panic. Your Honor, Daniel Rodriguez isn't just some kid who reads law in his spare time. He's been accepted to Harvard Law School. With a full scholarship, the courtroom exploded with noise. People started talking all at once, some standing up to get a better look at Daniel, others pulling out their phones. The bailiff shouted for order, but his voice was drowned out by the sudden chaos. Judge Hendricks banged her gavel 3 times, hard enough that the sound echoed off the walls. Order. I will have order in this courtroom. Gradually, the noise died down. People settled back into their seats, but the energy in the room had completely changed. Everyone was staring at Daniel now, and not with mockery or amusement. They were looking at him like they were seeing him for the first time. Daniel's face had gone from pale to bright red. He looked down at his worn sneakers, his hands gripping the edge of the defendant's table so hard his knuckles were white. Judge Hendricks turned to the reporter, her eyes sharp. Mr. Wells, how do you know this information? I've been researching a story about exceptional students from disadvantaged backgrounds, the reporter explained. Mr. Rodriguez's name came up when I contacted Harvard's admissions office for comment on their recruitment practices. They mentioned him as one of the most remarkable applicants they'd received in years. When I looked into his background, I found out about his situation with his mother, his work schedule, and this traffic case. I've been planning to write about him. Without my permission, Daniel said quietly, but loud enough for everyone to hear. It's a matter of public record, the reporter replied, though he had the grace to look slightly uncomfortable. The court case is public. Your admission to Harvard is public. I'm just connecting the dots. Mr. Wells, sit down, Judge Hendricks ordered, and turn off your phone. There will be no recording or live tweeting of these proceedings. The reporter sat, but he kept his notebook out, pen poised. The prosecutor, Davidson, was standing very still, looking like someone had just pulled the ground out from under him. His entire demeanor had changed. The confident, slightly amused expression was completely gone, replaced by something that looked almost like fear. He just spent the last 20 minutes condescending to and arguing with a kid who'd gotten into Harvard Law School. Your Honor, Davidson said, his voice careful now. I wasn't aware of Mr. Rodriguez's academic achievements. Why would you be? Daniel asked, and there was an edge to his voice now. An anger that he'd been holding back. Why would any of you be? You took one look at me and decided I was nobody. Just another poor kid trying to get out of a ticket. Mr. Rodriguez, the prosecutor started. No, Daniel interrupted. You laughed at me. You rolled your eyes. You suggested I'd been watching too much TV. You called my arguments a waste of time. And why? Because I'm wearing old clothes? Because I work at a diner? Because I'm 17? The courtroom was silent again. But this time it was the silence of collective shame. Several people who'd laughed earlier were now looking anywhere but at Daniel. Judge Hendricks cleared her throat. Mr. Rodriguez, you're right. And I apologize. This court treated you with less respect than you deserved. That was wrong. Daniel blinked, clearly not expecting that. Thank you, Your Honor. However, the judge continued, we still need to resolve the legal issues at hand. Mr. Wells's revelation, while dramatic, doesn't change the facts of the case. Actually, Your Honor, the reporter spoke up again, ignoring the judge's annoyed glance. There's more you should know about Mr. Rodriguez, Mr. Wells. I told you to sit quietly. With respect, Your Honor, this is relevant. Mr. Rodriguez hasn't just been studying law for himself. For the past year, he's been volunteering at the Community Legal Center on weekends. He helps other people prepare for court, reviews their documents, explains their rights. He's been doing it for free on his own time. Daniel's face got even redder. That's not relevant to this case. It is, the reporter insisted, because it shows what kind of person you are. The staff at the center told me you've helped dozens of families. You helped a single mother fight a wrongful eviction. You helped an elderly man get his disability benefits restored. You helped 3 different families dispute unfair debts. I just did research for them, Daniel muttered. I didn't represent anyone in court or anything like that. I'm not a lawyer. Not yet, the reporter said. But you will be. Judge Hendricks was watching this exchange with an expression that was hard to read. Finally, she looked at Daniel. Is this true? You've been helping other people with their legal problems? Daniel nodded reluctantly. The legal center has volunteer attorneys, but they're overwhelmed. They can't take every case, so I help with the basic stuff. Research, form preparation, explaining what documents mean. Things like that. While working full-time and taking care of your mother, the judge said. And finishing high school, the reporter added. He graduated last spring with a 4.0 GPA, valedictorian of his class. Okay, stop, Daniel said, his voice firmer now. I appreciate you trying to help, but this feels wrong. I didn't come here to tell everyone my life story. I came here to challenge an unfair citation, which you've done brilliantly, Judge Hendricks said. Mr. Rodriguez, off the record. Why didn't you mention any of this earlier? Your acceptance to Harvard, your volunteer work, your academic achievements, it might have changed how people viewed your arguments. Daniel met her eyes. Because it shouldn't matter, Your Honor. The law should apply the same way whether I'm going to Harvard or whether I'm a high school dropout. Whether I volunteer at a legal center or whether I've never set foot in one. Justice is supposed to be blind, right? It's not supposed to care about who you are or what you've accomplished. It's only supposed to care about what's true and what's right. The courtroom was so quiet you could hear people breathing. Several people in the gallery were openly staring at Daniel with expressions of respect or even awe. The bailiff had stopped looking stern and just looked impressed. The prosecutor stood up slowly. Your Honor, may I approach the bench? Come forward. Davidson walked to the judge's bench and Daniel joined him. The 3 of them spoke in low voices that the gallery couldn't quite hear, but everyone strained to listen anyway. Your Honor, the prosecutor said quietly, I think it's clear that this case has gotten away from what it should have been. I'm prepared to drop the reckless driving charge and reduce it to illegal parking. Mr. Rodriguez can pay a $50 fine and we can all move on. No, Daniel said. Both the judge and prosecutor looked at him in surprise. No, Davidson repeated. If you're offering to reduce the charge, it means you know the original charge won't hold up, which means I'm right about the law. So why should I accept a conviction for something else? Why should I pay any fine at all? The prosecutor's jaw clenched. Because it's a reasonable compromise. It's not reasonable to plead guilty to something I didn't do just because it's easier for everyone. That's exactly the kind of thinking that lets innocent people get convicted. They take the deal because they're tired or scared or can't afford to fight. But I'm not tired. I'm not scared. And I've made it this far. Judge Hendricks studied Daniel for a long moment. Mr. Rodriguez, you do understand that if I side with the state, you'll be liable for the full $500 fine? I understand, Your Honor. And you're willing to take that risk rather than accept a $50 fine? It's not about the money anymore, Your Honor. It's about the principle. The prosecutor looked like he wanted to argue, but Judge Hendricks held up her hand. That's enough. Return to your tables. They walked back to their respective positions. The courtroom waited, everyone on the edge of their seats. Judge Hendricks looked down at her notes, at the police report, at Daniel standing there in his worn clothes with his thin folder of handwritten notes. This court will take a 15-minute recess, she announced. Mr. Rodriguez, Mr. Davidson, you're both to remain in the courtroom. Everyone else, you may step outside. The gallery erupted in disappointed groans, but people started filing out. The reporter tried to approach Daniel, but the bailiff blocked his way and pointed him toward the exit. Within a few minutes, the courtroom was empty except for the judge, the prosecutor, Daniel, and the bailiff. Judge Hendricks came down from her bench and sat at one of the tables in the gallery, gesturing for Daniel and the prosecutor to join her. It was an unusual move, breaking down the formal structure of the courtroom, but it made the conversation feel more human. Mr. Rodriguez, the judge began, I want to be straight with you. You've made excellent arguments today. You clearly know the law better than most people who walk through my courtroom, including some of the attorneys. But you need to understand something. Fighting this case could have consequences beyond just the fine. What do you mean? Daniel asked. If you lose, you'll have a conviction on your record. That could affect your future. Law schools don't like to admit students with criminal records, even minor ones. I've already been admitted to Harvard, Daniel pointed out. Yes, but that admission is conditional on you maintaining good standing. A criminal conviction could give them grounds to rescind their offer. Daniel felt his stomach drop. He hadn't thought of that. The prosecutor saw his expression and jumped in. Your Honor is right, Mr. Rodriguez. This is a risk you don't need to take. Accept the illegal parking charge. It's not a criminal offense. It won't affect your record in any meaningful way. You pay $50, which I'm sure is still a hardship, but it's better than $500. And you move on with your life. You go to Harvard. You become a lawyer. You help people. Isn't that better than risking everything on principle? Daniel was quiet for a long time. He could feel both adults watching him, waiting for him to make the sensible choice. The smart choice, the safe choice, but something inside him refused, Your Honor, he said slowly. When I was 14, my mom got sick. We had insurance, but it didn't cover a lot of the treatments she needed. The insurance company kept denying her claims, saying the treatments were experimental or not medically necessary. We couldn't afford a lawyer to fight them. We didn't know how to navigate the system, so we just accepted it. We accepted that my mom would suffer because we didn't know how to fight back. He paused, his voice getting stronger. That's when I started learning about the law, because I realized that people like us, people without money or connections, we get pushed around by the system every single day. We get told to accept things that aren't right because fighting back is too hard or too expensive or too risky. And the more people who just accept it, the more broken the system becomes. Judge Hendricks was listening intently, her expression serious. So no, Daniel continued, I won't accept a conviction for something I didn't do. Not even a minor one, because if I do that, I'm part of the problem. I'm teaching myself that it's okay to compromise on justice when it's convenient. And if I believe that now, how can I be a good lawyer later? The silence that followed Daniel's words felt heavy, like the air itself had weight. Judge Hendricks looked at him for what seemed like a very long time, her expression unreadable. The prosecutor stared down at his hands, saying nothing. Finally, the judge stood up. All right, let's get back on the record. They returned to their positions, the formal structure of the courtroom restored. The bailiff called everyone back in from the hallway, and the gallery filled up again. If anything, there were more people than before. Word had spread during the recess, and curious court staff from other floors had found excuses to peek in. Judge Hendricks settled into her chair and looked out at the packed courtroom. Then she looked at Daniel, and something in her expression had changed. The skepticism was gone. So was the amusement. What remained was respect. Mr. Rodriguez, she began, I've been a judge for 19 years. In that time, I've seen thousands of cases and thousands of defendants. Some were guilty. Some were innocent. Some were somewhere in between. But I can honestly say I've never seen anyone quite like you. Daniel stood very still, barely breathing. You came into this courtroom today and you were mocked. You were dismissed. You were treated as if you were wasting everyone's time, and yet you stood your ground. You presented cogent legal arguments. You cited case law from memory. You demonstrated an understanding of legal procedure that would be impressive coming from a practicing attorney, let alone a 17-year-old working 2 jobs and caring for a sick parent. The judge paused, glancing at the prosecutor. Mr. Davidson, do you have the calibration records for Officer Thompson's radar device? The prosecutor stood. No, Your Honor. I contacted the police department during the recess. The device in question was taken out of service 3 weeks ago due to calibration issues. The records show it had not been calibrated within the required time frame at the time of Mr. Rodriguez's citation. A murmur ran through the gallery. Daniel felt something release in his chest, but he kept his expression neutral. So the radar reading in the officer's report was taken with a device that wasn't properly calibrated, the judge said. Yes, Your Honor, which means that reading is unreliable. Yes, Your Honor. Judge Hendricks nodded slowly. Mr. Davidson, does the state wish to continue with this prosecution? The prosecutor looked at Daniel, then back at the judge. Your Honor, in light of the equipment issues and Mr. Rodriguez's arguments regarding the application of the reckless driving statute, the state requests permission to withdraw the charges. Denied, the judge said. Everyone in the courtroom looked confused. Daniel most of all. Your Honor, the prosecutor asked. You want to withdraw the charges and walk away, but that's not enough. Mr. Rodriguez didn't come here asking for the charges to be withdrawn. He came here asking for them to be dismissed. Those are 2 very different things. I'm not sure I understand the distinction Your Honor is making, Davidson said carefully. When charges are withdrawn, it's the state's decision. It suggests that the state could refile them later if it wanted to. But when charges are dismissed, it's the court's ruling that the charges were improper to begin with. It's a statement that the defendant was wrongly accused. Judge Hendricks turned to Daniel. Mr. Rodriguez came here and proved, beyond any doubt, that this citation was improperly issued. He proved that the equipment used was faulty. He proved that the statute was misapplied. He proved that no actual reckless behavior occurred. He did the work that the state should have done before bringing charges in the first place, and he did it while being laughed at and dismissed by nearly everyone in this room. She picked up her gavel. Based on the evidence presented, or rather the lack thereof, and based on Mr. Rodriguez's compelling legal arguments, I am dismissing all charges against the defendant with prejudice. The citation is vacated. The record will reflect that Mr. Rodriguez is innocent of all charges. Furthermore, I am ordering the state to reimburse Mr. Rodriguez for his lost wages from missing work today. The courtroom erupted. People were clapping, some were even cheering. The bailiff didn't even try to stop them this time. Daniel stood frozen, not quite believing what he'd just heard. Mr. Rodriguez, the judge said, waiting for the noise to die down.